They laughed when he stayed. They laughed when everyone else packed their cars and left town. He didn't argue. He didn't explain. He just closed the door and stayed. The old man lived alone with his dog at the edge of town. No backup, no help coming. And winter was already moving in. What they didn't know was that one quiet decision would decide who survived the storm. The winter air had not yet turned violent, but it carried a thin, quiet warning as gray clouds hung low over the edge of town, pressing cold breath into every open space. Thomas Hale lived in a narrow, weather-beaten house just beyond the last streetlight, where the pavement gave way to gravel, and the town seemed to lose interest in whoever came next. At 68, Thomas moved with the careful economy of a man who had learned not to waste motion or words. He was tall once, people said, but time had folded his posture slightly forward, giving him a reserved, guarded silhouette. His shoulders were still broad beneath a heavy canvas jacket, faded by years of snow and sun, and his hands, large, scarred, and permanently rough, suggested a life spent working through pain rather than around it. A short gray beard lined his jaw, trimmed not for style but for function, and deep-set eyes the color of winter steel rarely lingered on anyone long enough to invite conversation. People in town described him as distant, unfriendly, even strange, but none of them knew the events that had shaped the silence he carried like a second coat. Years earlier, a single night had taught Thomas the cost of hesitation, a moment when a choice delayed by seconds had changed the outcome of something he could never undo. And since then, he trusted action over explanation, presence over comfort. The dog was the one thing that never surprised anyone, though they never truly understood it either. The German shepherd, named Rex, was nearly 9 years old, large even by the breed standards, with a thick sable coat already dusted with premature gray around the muzzle. His ears stood alert but relaxed, the posture of an animal that no longer needed to prove anything. Rex walked beside Thomas without a leash, close enough that their shadows overlapped in the low afternoon light, and his amber eyes tracked the world with a steady calm that mirrored his owner's. The bond between them was obvious in small ways. The way Thomas slowed instinctively when Rex's stride shortened, the way the dog leaned subtly into Thomas's leg whenever unfamiliar sounds carried on the wind. They had not always lived at the edge of town. Years ago, before the quiet became permanent, Thomas had been someone others relied on, someone whose presence meant order and chaos. But the town did not remember that version of him, or perhaps it chose not to. To them, he was simply the old man who refused to leave. As winter crept closer, conversations shifted. Neighbors packed trucks, nailed plywood over windows, and spoke loudly about forecasts and safety. At the general store, where Thomas went once a week for supplies, the clerk, a woman named Sarah Miller, mid-40s, slender with tired eyes and chestnut hair, always pulled into a loose ponytail, watched him with a mix of concern and uncertainty. Sarah was kind in the way people became kind after seeing too many things go wrong. She noticed the extra canned food Thomas placed on the counter, the heavy bags of rice, the kerosene tucked carefully into his cart, and she hesitated before speaking, her voice soft but edged with worry. She asked if he had somewhere safe to go, if someone was expecting him, if he had heard how bad the winter was supposed to be. Thomas met her gaze briefly, nodded once, and said only that he was prepared. It wasn't reassurance she wanted, but she accepted the answer because pushing further felt intrusive. Others were less gentle. Outside the store, a pair of men loading supplies into a pickup glanced toward Thomas and Rex and laughed quietly, the sound sharp in the cold air. One of them shook his head, muttering that stubbornness wasn't bravery, that staying behind was foolish, that an old man and a dog didn't stand a chance against what was coming. Thomas heard them. He always did. But he kept walking, boots crunching against frozen gravel, Rex pacing calmly at his side. He did not correct them, did not explain the reinforced walls hidden behind peeling paint, the zapas of firewood stacked with military precision behind the house, the generator tested weekly, or the habits drilled into him long before age had slowed his reflexes. He did not explain that preparation, to him, was not loud or performative. It was quiet, methodical, and invisible to those who weren't looking. At the edge of town, children sometimes stared from car windows as Thomas passed, curious but uncertain, while parents pulled them closer, as if solitude were contagious. The house itself looked like an argument waiting to be lost. Old siding, narrow windows, a roofline bowed slightly under the promise of snow. People assumed neglect where there was intention, weakness where there was resolve. Inside, the space was clean and sparse, every object placed with purpose. Rex's bed sat near the wood stove, worn but carefully mended, and Thomas's chair faced the single front window, not for comfort but for visibility. In the evenings, as temperatures dropped and the wind began to speak in longer sentences, Thomas sat with a cup of black coffee cooling slowly in his hands, listening not just to the weather, but to his own thoughts. He remembered the way laughter used to sound different, how once it had meant relief instead of judgment. He knew the town believed he was making a mistake, that his choice to stay marked him as careless or proud. But to Thomas, leaving would have meant something worse than danger. It would have meant walking away from the one promise he had never broken, to remain present when others stepped back. Rex sensed the change in the air before the forecasts turned urgent. He lingered closer at night, lifting his head at unfamiliar sounds, placing his body between Thomas and the door whenever the wind rattled the frame too hard. Thomas noticed, not with fear, but with recognition. The world was shifting, and soon the laughter would stop. The people who had spoken so easily about storms from warm kitchens would understand that winter did not announce itself with drama. It arrived quietly, the way judgment often did, and it tested not strength, but preparation. As the first serious snowfall dusted the road leading out of town, Thomas and Rex remained where they were, two figures framed against a gray horizon, misunderstood but unmoved, waiting not to prove anyone wrong, but simply to endure what they had already accepted was coming. The whispers followed Thomas Hale more closely now, moving through the town faster than the weather itself. They gathered in places he never lingered long enough to hear directly, at the gas pumps near the post office steps, inside warm kitchens where people spoke freely about danger, because they believed it would never reach them personally. To many, Thomas had become a symbol of stubbornness, a quiet warning of what not to be when winter arrived in full force. They spoke of him as if he were already a problem to be solved, an inconvenience waiting to happen. Some said the dog would be his undoing, that caring for an animal at his age was reckless, irresponsible. Others argued the opposite, that the dog was the only reason he hadn't left, a burden he was too proud to abandon. No one considered that the choice might be deliberate or that Thomas understood exactly what he was facing. Sarah Miller noticed the shift before most people did. Working the counter at the general store gave her a front row seat to the town's anxieties, and as the days shortened, the conversations grew sharper. Sarah was 46, tall and slender with narrow shoulders that made her look more fragile than she was. Her chestnut hair, streaked with early gray she never bothered to hide, was usually pulled into a loose ponytail that brushed the back of her jacket. Her skin was pale from years spent indoors under fluorescent lights, and faint lines around her eyes hinted at long nights spent worrying about people she couldn't save. She had learned to listen carefully, to notice what people said and what they avoided saying. When Thomas came in again, his presence drew attention in a way it hadn't before. Conversations paused, eyes followed him as he moved down the aisle, and Sarah felt the tension settle like static. Thomas didn't rush. He selected items with quiet certainty: lamp oil, extra batteries, canned meat, placing them in his basket without hesitation. Rex waited near the door, lying down but alert, his body angled so he could see both Thomas and the entrance. A few customers glanced at the dog with thinly veiled annoyance, as if his calm obedience somehow challenged their assumptions. One man, Harold Dunn, stood near the counter pretending to study a rack of gloves. Harold was in his late 50s, heavy-set with a ruddy face and thinning blonde hair that clung to his scalp in uneven patches. He had lived in town his entire life and wore familiarity like authority. His beard was untrimmed, his jacket too light for the cold he insisted wasn't serious yet. Harold watched Thomas with a tight smile and finally spoke, his voice loud enough to carry. He said it was going to be a bad winter, that even younger folks were getting out while they could. He said the roads would be impassable, that rescue wouldn't come, that staying behind was asking for trouble. The words were framed as concern, but the tone betrayed something else, judgment mixed with the need to be right. Thomas met Harold's gaze briefly. There was no anger in his expression, no defensiveness. He nodded once and said he understood. That was all. The lack of explanation unsettled Harold more than an argument would have. Silence left too much room for doubt, and doubt made people uncomfortable. Outside, as Thomas loaded supplies into the back of his truck, a few heads shook in quiet disbelief. Someone muttered that he'd be the first to call for help. Someone else said the dog would suffer most. Thomas heard fragments carried on the wind, but he didn't respond. Rex jumped into the passenger seat with practiced ease, settling in without being told. The drive back to the house was slow, not because of traffic, but because Thomas allowed himself to feel the weight of what the town believed about him. It wasn't the judgment itself that bothered him. It was how easily people filled silence with assumptions. Years ago, he might have corrected them. He might have explained the discipline that came from a life where preparation was survival, where trust was earned through consistency, not conversation. But experience had taught him that explanations rarely changed minds. They only delayed decisions. At home, Thomas stacked supplies methodically, each item placed where it could be reached in the dark if necessary. Rex followed him from room to room, watching, learning, though there was nothing left to teach the dog. The routine steadied Thomas's thoughts, pulling him away from the memory of voices layered with doubt. As evening fell, headlights swept past the house less frequently. Most of the town was leaving now, caravans of vehicles heading toward perceived safety. Thomas stood on the porch for a moment, feeling the temperature drop sharply as the sun disappeared. Rex sat beside him, ears forward, breath steady. In the fading light, Thomas remembered another time when people had questioned his judgment, when staying had been harder than leaving. That memory had carved caution into him, not fear. He had learned then that responsibility didn't end when others chose to walk away. The town saw an old man refusing to move. They did not see a man who understood isolation well enough to prepare for it. As night settled in, the whispers continued somewhere beyond the trees, but they no longer reached the house. Inside, the quiet was deliberate, controlled. Thomas poured food into Rex's bowl, watching the dog eat with unhurried focus. Outside, the first real wind of the season pressed against the walls, testing them. Thomas listened without concern. He had accepted long ago that judgment often arrived before understanding. What mattered was not being believed, but being ready. The storm arrived without ceremony, slipping into the valley overnight and sealing the town beneath a weight of snow and wind that erased all sense of distance. By morning, the road leading out was no longer a road at all, just a pale, uneven scar swallowed by drifts. The sky pressed low and heavy, muting sound, bending light, turning every familiar shape into something uncertain. Thomas Hale woke before dawn, not because of fear, but because his body had learned to recognize the moment when conditions changed from difficult to dangerous. He sat on the edge of the bed listening, counting the seconds between gusts, feeling the subtle vibration in the walls as the wind tested the structure. At 68, his movements were slower, but his awareness was sharp, honed by years when weather and timing had mattered more than comfort. Rex lifted his head from the floor beside the bed, amber eyes alert, ears angling toward the door. The dog was nearly 9 now, his joints stiffer in the cold, but there was no hesitation in the way he rose and followed Thomas, nails clicking softly against the wood. Outside, the first attempt to open the door confirmed what Thomas already knew. Snow had piled high against the frame, packed tight by the wind. He did not force it. Instead, he moved methodically, lighting the stove, checking the generator, confirming what still worked and what would need to be conserved. This was not panic. It was procedure. As the hours passed, the storm intensified. Visibility dropped to nothing beyond the nearest fence post. Somewhere closer to town, power lines snapped under the strain, and the familiar glow that usually hovered faintly on the horizon disappeared. Thomas noted the absence without comment. Rex paced once, then settled near the stove, positioning himself where he could watch both Thomas and the door. The sound of the wind changed as the day wore on, deepening, gaining a low, insistent rhythm that pressed against the house like a question demanding an answer. In town, those who had stayed behind realized too late that forecasts did not capture isolation. Sarah Miller stood at the front window of the general store, watching snow erase the parking lot she had swept clean the night before. She was wrapped in a thick sweater beneath her coat, her slender frame tense with worry. Her chestnut hair had slipped loose from its ponytail, strands clinging to her pale face as she breathed against the cold glass. Sarah was not alone. 2 other residents had taken shelter inside the store, drawn by its generator and stocked shelves. None of them spoke much. Their thoughts drifted to the same question, unspoken but heavy. Who else was out there? Sarah thought of Thomas. She pictured him at the edge of town, alone in that narrow house, and felt a tightness in her chest she tried to ignore. She told herself he had chosen this, that he knew what he was doing. But doubt, once planted, was hard to dislodge. Back at the house, Thomas moved through the hours with deliberate calm. He rationed fuel, melted snow for water despite having reserves, preserving supplies he might need later. Rex followed each step, occasionally stopping to listen, his body tense when a particularly strong gust rattled the walls. Late in the afternoon, a sound cut through the wind, metal scraping against ice, distant but distinct. Thomas paused, hand resting on the table, eyes narrowing. He waited. The sound came again, followed by a muffled impact. Something had shifted outside. Pulling on his heavy coat, Thomas grabbed a flashlight and opened the side door just enough to peer out. Snow lashed his face instantly, stinging exposed skin. He saw a section of the old fence had collapsed under the weight, boards snapping free and disappearing into the drift. It was not immediately dangerous, but it was a reminder that the storm was still building. He closed the door, sealing the cold out, and made a note to address it when the wind eased. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply. The house creaked, responding to pressure, but held. Rex grew restless, rising often, standing near Thomas with his head low, eyes fixed on the door. The dog sensed what Thomas already understood. The storm was not finished. Somewhere in the darkness, a long, hollow sound carried through the wind, followed by another, closer this time. Thomas froze, listening intently. It was not the house. It was not the trees. It was human. A shout, torn apart by the wind, barely audible but unmistakable. Thomas did not hesitate. He pulled on boots, tightened his jacket, and reached for the flashlight. Rex was at his side instantly, body rigid with focus. Opening the door was like stepping into a wall. Snow drove sideways, blinding and thick, swallowing the beam of light after only a few feet. Thomas anchored himself, moving slowly, using memory as much as sight. The sound came again, weaker now. He followed it, counting steps, trusting the discipline that had once guided him through far worse conditions. Rex moved ahead, nose low, cutting through the drift with determination despite the cold biting into his legs. The source emerged gradually, a dark shape half buried near the road's edge, barely distinguishable from the snow. A man lay there, curled instinctively, arms drawn close to his chest. Thomas knelt, ignoring the cold seeping through his clothes, and shook the man gently. The stranger was younger, maybe in his 30s, face pale beneath a dusting of ice, dark hair plastered to his forehead. His beard was short and uneven, the kind grown without intention, and his eyes fluttered open briefly before closing again. He was conscious, but fading. Rex stood close, pressing his body against the man's side, offering warmth without being commanded. Thomas assessed quickly. Shallow breathing, signs of exposure, but no obvious injuries. He knew what had to be done. Getting the man inside would take time, strength, and precision. The storm did not pause to allow for planning. With effort, Thomas got the stranger to his feet, supporting his weight as Rex stayed close, alert, and steady. Each step back toward the house felt heavier than the last, the wind pushing back, testing resolve. When they finally crossed the threshold, Thomas closed the door behind them, shutting out the storm with a final decisive motion. The house fell quiet again, the wind reduced to a distant roar. Thomas eased the man onto the floor near the stove, removing snow-soaked clothing, wrapping him in blankets. Rex lay down beside them, breath slow but watchful. Outside, the storm continued to rage, indifferent to the small act of defiance that had just taken place. Inside, the choice Thomas had made, staying when others left, had already begun to matter in ways no one in town could yet see. Morning did not arrive so much as it seeped in, pale and uncertain, filtered through snow that had not stopped falling since the night before. The storm had lost its fury but not its grip, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt heavier than the wind itself. Thomas Hale opened his eyes slowly, the stiffness in his joints a reminder of the long night that had passed. The house smelled of damp wool, melted snow, and wood smoke. Familiar scents layered now with something new, the shallow, uneven breathing of the man lying on the floor near the stove. The stranger had survived the night, but just barely. His face, no longer blue with cold, was still ashen, lips cracked, eyes closed tight as if sleep itself required effort. Thomas knelt beside him, checking pulse, warmth, signs of awareness. He had done this before, in other places, under other circumstances, and the habits returned without hesitation. Rex lay close, his large body stretched along the man's side, providing steady heat. The dog's amber eyes followed Thomas's movements, alert but calm, as if understanding the gravity of the moment. Outside, the world was erased. The road, the fence, even the familiar outline of the trees had disappeared beneath a uniform white that blurred distance and direction. Thomas stepped carefully to the front window and wiped a clear patch with his sleeve. Nothing moved, no tire tracks, no smoke from neighboring chimneys. The town felt impossibly far away, though it lay only a few miles beyond the drifts. The silence pressed in, not peaceful, but expectant, as if waiting to see what would happen next. Inside the general store, Sarah Miller woke to the same quiet and felt her stomach tighten. The generator hummed steadily, but the absence of outside sound made it feel louder, intrusive. She wrapped her arms around herself, her slender frame tense beneath her coat, and moved to the window. Snow covered everything she could see, softening edges, hiding hazards. The two others who had sheltered there were still asleep, their faces drawn with exhaustion. Sarah's thoughts returned, uninvited, to Thomas and Rex. No lights had appeared overnight from the edge of town, no sign of movement. The silence felt wrong. She told herself again that Thomas was prepared, that he had chosen this, but doubt gnawed at her resolve. She wondered how many people could endure that kind of quiet without breaking. Back at the house, the rescued man stirred weakly. His eyes opened for a moment, unfocused, then settled on Thomas's face. He tried to speak, but the sound caught in his throat, more breath than voice. Thomas leaned closer, his tone low, steady, giving simple instructions. Rest, breathe, don't move. The man nodded faintly, eyelids fluttering closed again. Thomas did not ask questions. Names could wait. Survival could not. He prepared warm liquid, lifting the man's head carefully, watching for signs of response. Rex shifted closer, his tail thumping once against the floor, then stilling. Time passed slowly, measured in small improvements, steadier breathing, a hint of color returning to the man's cheeks. Outside, the silence deepened. The wind had died completely, leaving the snow unmoving, untouched. It was the kind of quiet that unsettled even those accustomed to solitude. Thomas felt it too, a subtle tension beneath his practiced calm. He checked the radio again. Static. No signal. Communications were down. Rescue would not come quickly, if at all. The responsibility he had accepted by staying now expanded, encompassing not just himself and Rex, but a stranger whose life depended entirely on the decisions made within these walls. As the day wore on, the temperature dropped again. Thomas moved through the house with deliberate purpose, reinforcing doors, clearing vents, conserving power. Each action pushed back against the isolation, asserting order where chaos threatened. Rex followed, occasionally pausing at the door, ears lifting as if expecting sound that never came. In town, hours passed with no news. Sarah attempted to reach emergency services again, her voice tight as she spoke into the radio, repeating locations, names, hoping for acknowledgement. None came. The silence answered instead. She pictured Thomas's house buried under snow, imagined the old man sitting alone, stubbornly refusing help that no longer existed. Guilt crept in alongside fear. The town had judged him, laughed at him, assumed weakness where there was resolve. Now the cost of that judgment loomed large. At the edge of town, Thomas stood once more at the window as dusk approached. The light faded quickly, swallowed by cloud and snow. He glanced back at the stranger, still unconscious but stable, then down at Rex, who met his gaze with unwavering trust. The silence outside remained absolute, broken only by the faint crackle of the stove. Thomas understood then that silence could be more dangerous than noise. It hid problems, delayed action, allowed assumptions to harden into regret. He had chosen to stay because he knew this truth well. As night settled in again, the house stood alone against the white expanse, a single point of warmth and purpose in a world temporarily erased. The storm had passed, but its aftermath had only begun, and the quiet that followed would test endurance in ways the wind never could. The second night after the storm settled in differently, not with wind or snow, but with a tension that lingered in the quiet corners of the house. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt watchful. Thomas Hale sat in the chair near the stove, eyes open though his body ached for rest, listening to the rhythm of breathing around him. The stranger on the floor slept in shallow intervals, chest rising and falling unevenly beneath layers of blankets. Rex lay pressed against him, one powerful flank touching the man's side, the other angled toward Thomas as if positioning himself between two lives he felt responsible for guarding. The dog had barely moved since the rescue. Even when Thomas rose to tend the fire or check the doors, Rex followed with his eyes, lifting his head only long enough to confirm everything was as it should be. Rex was 9 years old now, his muzzle graying, his movements slower than they once were, but nothing in his posture suggested weakness. His coat, thick and coarse, trapped warmth efficiently, and his steady presence filled the room in a way no words could. Thomas noticed the way the dog flinched slightly whenever the stranger's breathing faltered, the way his ears twitched at sounds Thomas himself barely registered. This was not training. This was instinct refined by years of shared survival. Thomas remembered when Rex had first come into his life, younger then, restless, still learning how to trust. That had been after the night Thomas rarely allowed himself to revisit, the night when hesitation had cost him someone he could not bring back. The dog had not replaced that loss, but he had given Thomas a reason to stay anchored, to remain attentive to the present instead of retreating into memory. Now, watching Rex refuse rest, Thomas felt a familiar tightening in his chest, a mix of gratitude and concern. He spoke quietly to the dog, his voice low and calm, telling him it was all right to lie down, that the man was stable for now. Rex did not respond the way a younger dog might have. He did not shift position or relax. He simply looked at Thomas, eyes steady, acknowledging the words without accepting the permission. Thomas understood. Some responsibilities were not negotiable. Outside, the temperature continued to drop, and frost crept along the inside edges of the windows. Thomas moved carefully, conserving energy, checking on the stranger periodically. When the man stirred again, more awake this time, Thomas offered water and spoke gently, asking simple questions. The man managed a name, Evan Parker, his voice hoarse, his face tightening with effort. Evan was 32, lean beneath the blankets, his dark hair matted with sweat and meltwater. His skin was pale, almost translucent in the low light, and faint lines at the corners of his eyes suggested exhaustion rather than age. He explained in broken phrases that his car had slid off the road hours before the storm peaked, that he had tried to walk for help, underestimating the distance, the cold, the speed with which strength drained away. Thomas listened without judgment. He had heard variations of this story before, in different forms, all rooted in the same assumption, that danger announced itself loudly enough to be avoided. Rex remained close as Evan spoke, shifting only to press more firmly against him when his voice faltered. Evan noticed then, his gaze settling on the dog with something like disbelief. He reached out slowly, hesitantly, and Rex allowed it, lowering his head just enough for Evan's fingers to brush the thick fur at his neck. The contact seemed to ground him. His breathing steadied, and his shoulders relaxed slightly for the first time. Thomas watched the exchange in silence, aware that something important was happening that did not require his intervention. As the night deepened, Thomas felt the weight of fatigue finally settle into his bones. He leaned back in the chair, eyes closing briefly, trusting Rex to alert him if anything changed. And Rex did. Hours later, when Evan's breathing grew shallow again, Rex rose immediately, nudging Thomas's knee insistently until he woke. Thomas responded without hesitation, adjusting blankets, warming water, monitoring the man until the crisis passed. The dog did not leave Evan's side, not even when Thomas tried again to coax him away to rest. At some point before dawn, Rex's legs trembled slightly from the strain of staying alert for so long. Thomas noticed and knelt beside him, resting a hand on the dog's broad shoulder. He spoke softly, not as an owner issuing a command, but as a partner acknowledging effort. Rex leaned into the touch for just a moment, then resumed his watch. When light finally began to return, thin and colorless, Thomas realized that the night had taken more from the dog than from him. Yet Rex showed no sign of regret or reluctance. His loyalty was not dramatic. It was quiet, persistent, and absolute. Evan slept more soundly now, color slowly returning to his face. The worst seemed to have passed, though recovery would take time. Thomas stood and stretched, joints protesting, and looked down at Rex with a depth of appreciation he rarely allowed himself to feel openly. In that stillness, Thomas understood something the town never had. Survival was rarely about strength alone. It was about staying present, about refusing to turn away, and sometimes it was about a dog who would not leave even when rest was offered. Outside, the world remained frozen and silent, but inside the house, a bond forged long before the storm continued to hold everything together. The first sound that broke the isolation was not a voice, but an engine. It arrived faintly at first, a low mechanical murmur carried unevenly through the frozen air, so unfamiliar after days of silence that Thomas Hale almost dismissed it as imagination. He stood near the window, one hand resting on the frame, listening carefully. Rex lifted his head at the same moment, ears forward, body tense but not alarmed. The sound came again, clearer this time. A snowplow, slow, deliberate, cutting a narrow path through what had once been a road. Thomas exhaled quietly. Help, it seemed, had finally remembered them. Outside, the world was still locked in white, but movement had returned, and with it, consequence. In town, Sarah Miller heard the engine too. She was standing near the store's door, her coat already on, chestnut hair pulled back tightly, pale face drawn with relief and exhaustion. When the plow emerged from the snowfall, she stepped forward instinctively, waving, calling out directions. Words spilled from her faster than she could organize them. There was an old man at the edge of town, she told them, a house beyond the last streetlight. He hadn't left. He was alone. Or at least, she thought he was. The crew exchanged glances. One of them, a man in his early 40s named Ben Carter, tall with a solid build and a dark beard lined with frost, nodded grimly. Ben had worked winter response for years and had learned to take concern seriously, especially when it came late. The plow turned toward Thomas's road. By the time they arrived, the house stood exactly as it always had, quiet, unassuming, almost invisible against the snow. Thomas opened the door before they knocked. He did not look surprised. Ben took in the scene quickly. The reinforced door, the stacked firewood, the clear paths shoveled despite the storm. Inside, warmth radiated outward. Evan lay resting near the stove, color back in his face, blankets tucked carefully around him. Rex stood between Evan and the doorway, calm but watchful. Ben removed his hat slowly. He asked how long Evan had been there. Thomas answered simply, "Since the storm. Since before anyone came looking." The room fell quiet. Sarah arrived moments later, breathless, eyes scanning the space until they landed on Thomas. Relief washed over her face, followed by something heavier, recognition. She saw then what she had missed before. This was not stubbornness. This was preparation. Ben radioed in the situation, his tone measured. A rescue unit would take Evan to town once the road was cleared further. He asked Thomas if he needed assistance, medical attention, supplies. Thomas shook his head. He said he was fine. Rex shifted closer at the sound of unfamiliar voices, then relaxed when Thomas rested a hand briefly on his neck. Word traveled quickly once the road reopened. By afternoon, a small group of townspeople gathered at a distance, curiosity pulling them closer despite lingering cold. Among them was Harold Dunn, his ruddy face paler now, his confident posture replaced by uncertainty. He watched as Evan was carefully helped into a vehicle, as Thomas stood quietly beside Rex, offering instructions without fanfare. Someone whispered that the old man had gone out into the storm. Someone else said he had saved a life. The laughter that had once followed Thomas's name did not return. Instead, silence did, but this time it carried weight. Harold stepped forward eventually, clearing his throat. He avoided Thomas's eyes at first, muttering something about being wrong, about underestimating him. Thomas listened without interruption. When Harold finished, Thomas nodded once, not in forgiveness or acceptance, but acknowledgement. There was no satisfaction in being proven right, only a quiet resolve that had existed long before judgment arrived. Sarah approached last. She thanked Thomas openly, her voice unsteady, eyes shining with unshed tears. She apologized for not trusting her instincts sooner. Thomas told her there was nothing to apologize for. People did what they needed to feel safe. It was what they did afterward that mattered. As the crowd dispersed, the house returned to its familiar quiet. But something had changed. The town would remember this winter differently now. They would remember the man they had dismissed, the dog they had called a burden, and the life that had been saved because someone stayed when leaving would have been easier. Thomas closed the door, shutting out the cold once more. Rex followed him inside, tail swaying gently. Outside, the plow continued its work, carving paths through snow and assumption alike. Inside, Thomas returned to his chair, the house steady around him. The storm had passed. The truth, long ignored, had finally arrived. Winter loosened its grip slowly, reluctantly, as if unwilling to admit it had finished what it came to do. Snow remained piled high along the roads, but the air softened, and the silence that once felt threatening began to feel reflective instead. Thomas Hale noticed the change not in the temperature, but in the way light returned to the valley, lingering longer each afternoon, touching the edges of things rather than flattening them into shadow. He moved through his days much as he always had, steady and unhurried, Rex close at his side. If anything, the dog seemed lighter now, his posture relaxed, his steps less guarded. The danger had passed. What remained was understanding. Evan Parker left town quietly a few days later, stronger now, bundled in borrowed clothes, gratitude written plainly across his tired face. He thanked Thomas without flourish, his words simple and sincere. Thomas accepted them with a nod. Some debts did not need ceremony. They needed to be remembered. Life in town resumed cautiously. People returned to their routines, but something subtle had shifted. When Thomas walked past the general store now, conversations did not stop. Instead, heads turned in acknowledgement. A few people nodded. One woman waved. Respect arrived without announcement, settling in the spaces where judgment had once lived. Sarah Miller watched this change from behind the counter, her expression thoughtful. She noticed how Thomas never lingered to receive it, never adjusted his pace or posture. He was unchanged by recognition, just as he had been unmoved by ridicule. That consistency stayed with her. Harold Dunn passed Thomas one morning near the road that had once disappeared under snow. He stopped, awkward and uncertain, then offered help with clearing debris. Thomas accepted without comment. No apologies were spoken, none were required. The work was done side by side, in silence, the kind that did not demand explanation. Rex lay nearby, watching, content. As weeks passed, winter became memory rather than threat. The house at the edge of town remained as it always had, unassuming, prepared, quietly occupied. Thomas spent his evenings by the stove, Rex at his feet, the radio occasionally crackling with distant voices now that signals had returned. He thought often about the storm, not with pride or bitterness, but with clarity. He understood now that the hardest part had never been the cold or the isolation. It had been choosing to stay present when it would have been easier to turn away. People spoke of courage as something loud, something announced. Thomas knew better. Courage was often invisible, revealed only when circumstances stripped away comfort and left choices exposed. It lived in preparation, in loyalty, in the refusal to abandon what mattered, simply because no one was watching. Rex shifted beside him, resting his head against Thomas's leg, eyes half closed. The dog had never cared how others saw them. He had only known where he belonged. Thomas rested a hand on Rex's broad shoulder, feeling the steady warmth beneath his palm. Outside, the snow began to melt, revealing the ground beneath, unchanged, enduring. Thomas did not wonder if people would remember what had happened that winter. It was enough that the lesson existed, quiet and unspoken. Strength did not always look like strength, and those who moved silently through the world often carried more than they showed. As night settled gently over the town, Thomas turned off the lamp and let the darkness come, not as an enemy, but as something familiar. Winter had come and gone. What remained was the simple truth that staying, noticing, and choosing to act could change a life, sometimes quietly, sometimes forever. Winter doesn't always end with noise. Sometimes it fades quietly, leaving behind the people who chose to stay. What mattered most wasn't strength, or being seen, or being right. It was presence, loyalty, and the courage to notice when others looked away. Sometimes survival looks like a quiet home, a loyal companion at your side, and the simple peace of knowing you did what was right. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to share it with someone who might need a reminder like this. And if you believe quiet courage still matters, you're always welcome here. Subscribe for more stories about loyalty, resilience, and the strength that doesn't ask to be seen. Thank you for being here, and thank you for staying. Winter eventually moved on. The town went quiet again. But the truth is, it wasn't the storm that changed everything. It was the moment. Someone chose not to walk away. Somewhere out there tonight, another quiet decision is being made. Another person is being underestimated. And another story is just beginning. Right here,